أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone, no partnership, never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters, friends and family, everybody tuning into the live stream, and everybody joining us for the Zoom meeting. Jazakallah khairan for joining us again for the Sunday discussion, where we will be continuing of the reading of Those Promised Paradise, Stories of the Sahaba, written by Noura, Durkee. Today we'll be getting into page 131 of Hamzah Ibn Abd al-Muttalib, where it is mentioned that Jibril came to me and told me that Hamzah was written among the people, among the seven heavens. Hamzah Ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the lion of Allah and the lion of his messenger, sallallahu. And this is said by Rasulullah sallallahu in Ibn Hisham, looks like reference 613. So the Prophet ﷺ used to say that those who were the best in the Jahiliyyah, the days of ignorance before Islam, would be even better after they became Muslims. And they were a number of very fine men and women among his own relatives and some of the noble families of the Quraysh. And some of them became Muslim early in the prophethood of Muhammad ﷺ, and some converted later. Yet there were those who never became Muslim for reasons that only Allah SWT knows. And among those people were some who had been close friends to Rasulullah sallallahu from his youth, who had played or eaten or had grown up with him. But before the revelation, they honored him highly. But after the revelation, some of them changed their attitudes and spoke of him insultingly, trying to harm him or with every word and every sort of action. And however, one who remained a close Sahabi to Muhammad sallallahu was his uncle and foster brother Hamzah ibn Abd al-Muttalib, and he himself was very well liked and respected and also feared because as he grew into a brave hunter and fighter, he became the strongest man in Mecca. And to be considered a good and noble person in Mecca in those days meant that one must possess certain qualifications, such as generosity, especially towards one's family or towards travelers, to be brave or to be graced in language, being able to recite poetry on the spot if it was called for, or having a noble lineage and trustworthiness. And one did not have to be wealthy, although, of course, wealth helped. Yet, oddly, some things did not affect one's noble status. It didn't hurt a man's reputation if he was a heavy drinker or if he beat his women or even killed his female children. Also, he could do anything he wanted to their slaves. And some thoughtful souls recognized that nobility had to mean more than just bravery and tradition, that it must include compassion and mercy as well. However, those who held this view in those days were few. And Hamzah himself was certainly a noble person, particularly towards his family, every member of which he honored very much. He was also very particular about attending to worship and making frequent visits to the idols of the Kaaba. Still, he did have some of the bad habits of his day, one of which was drinking, and others of which was not paying much attention to the world of ideas. And what Hamzah liked to do most was to hunt and be out in the desert. So when Muhammad sallallahu who was Hamzah's nephew and good friend, had ideas about Allah Azza wa Jal and the nature of reality, he probably did not go to Hamzah to discuss them. However, Hamzah was very loyal to Muhammad, so close to him that it was he who went with him to ask for the hand of Khadija bint Huwaylid in marriage. And when the revelation started to come, Muhammad kept them secret from all but his closest friends and family members. And after some time, Allah Azza wa Jalla ordered him to offer these revelations to his whole family, which included about 40 men. And he hosted a feast during which he told them that he was the messenger of Allah and that they should worship Allah Azza wa Jal only. And Hamzah was there, but he did not respond. Hamzah went on hunting and amusing himself during the first years of the mission of Rasulullah, paying little attention to his teachings. But as Rasulullah had himself said, Hamzah was very good to his family, and he did not want to upset them by breaking with the traditions unless he had to. And unlike many of his peers, however, he did not participate in the torture of the Muslims. He stayed out of that argument altogether. But on the other hand, Hamzah had a strong and impulsive nature, and when he felt something strongly, nothing and no one could stop him. And eventually, it was one of the following examples of Muhammad's actions in the face of adversity that convinced him, without doubt, to become one of the finest and most committed of Muslims. One day when Rasulullah was near the Kaaba in the hill of Asafa, Abu Jahl had passed by, and Abu Jahl was perhaps the most hateful man in Mecca towards Islam and Rasulullah. He had a cruel and a foul tongue, and when he saw Muhammad, he began to insult him. He called him all sorts of horrible names and said cruel and evil things about Islam. And Rasulullah took all the abuse without uttering a single word. And finally, Abu Jahl ran out of breath and went back beside the Kaaba, talking and laughing with other people. But Rasulullah went home shortly afterwards. And Hamzah soon came along, having just returned from hunting with his great bow hanging over his shoulder. And it was his custom whenever he would come back to the city to go first and honor the Kaaba before returning back to his family. And upon seeing the Kaaba, a woman from the family of Jad'an, who was herself friendly to Islam, ran out of her house and approached Hamzah. Having overheard the earlier treatment of Muhammad, she recounted with outrage over every word of Abu Jahl's ranting. If only you had seen how Muhammad, your brother's son, was treated by Abu Jahl, the son of Hisham, yet even though the horrible insults, Muhammad said not a word. And although Hamzah was generally an agreeable person, his anger and the sense of honor were aroused. He then became furious in realizing that he had been putting something important off for far too long. So he strode over to where Abu Jahl was sitting with the other men and hit him forcefully on the head with his bow, making him bleed. He then shouted, "Are you going to insult him now that I am of his religion, and now that I say what he says and believe what he believes? Hit me back if you can." And the men jumped up to defend Abu Jahl, but Abu Jahl decided not to fight Hamzah, saying, "Let him be, for indeed I insulted his nephew deeply." And this day Rasulullah found a protector. And afterwards, Hamzah found himself in a confusing predicament because he was a chief in the Quraysh and felt it dishonorable to leave the ways of his ancestors. But on the other hand, he loved Rasulullah and knew that whatever Muhammad believed and taught must be true. So thus he went to Rasulullah and he said, "You should be pleased I have taken revenge on you. For you on Abu Jahl." But Rasulullah said that he didn't care about such matters. He only cared that Hamzah should stop worshiping idols and join the straight way. And after a night of prayer and contemplation, Hamzah went to Rasulullah and talked to him. And his mind soon became convinced of what his heart had already known. He accepted Islam fully and spent most of his time after that with Rasulullah at the house of Arkam. And the Quraysh had to be more careful of what they did and said after the strongest man among them attached himself to Rasulullah. The next section states about the line of Allah. So not long after Hamzah became a Muslim, he was joined by another powerful Meccan, Omar ibn al-Khattab. Now the Muslims had two very strong supporters, Omar and Hamzah, and for the first time they were able to pray and speak in public places and go out again to the Kaaba, but the Quraysh found other forms of torture, and for 3 years Muslims had to stay in the desolate valley, banned from all public life and exchange. And Hamzah shared this time with Rasulullah, and when it was over, he supported him throughout the years of sadness, the time of which Khadija anha, and his uncle al-Muttalib, had passed away over the death of those loved ones. After this long period, they left the city that had denied the truth for a better place where they could establish the truth. And this place was then al-Madinah al-Munawwara, the city of light they had referenced. So the first year in Medina is usually remembered for the establishment of the first Islamic government, for the making of the treaties with the Jewish tribes, as well as the creation of the brotherhood between the Ansar and the Muhajirun. And during this time, however, there were several military missions, scouting into enemy territory, treaties with neighboring tribes, and confrontations with the Quraysh, but none resulted in bloodshed or armed conflict. But Hamzah was the general leader for the Muslim forces, and he often was in charge of troops of riders who were sent off to find caravans or to spy on the Quraysh. And his vast experience of hunting and shooting in the desert definitely served him well. But during the time of Ramadan, the second year of the Hijrah, the first major armed confrontation took place at the wells of Badr. And the Quraysh army was 3 times the size of the Muslim army and was much better equipped. However, the Muslims had the courage of conviction and faith, and they were not afraid to die, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his angels were there to help them. So Hamzah, Ali, and Ubaidah, anhu, all from the clan of Hashim, met the 3 Qurayshi warriors who came out to challenge the Muslims, and they swiftly killed the 3 Quraysh, thus starting the battle. This was, again, one of the traditions that the Arabs used to have at that time. They used to bring out their most ferocious of fighters and had them fight before the battle would commence. Hamzah was like a whirlwind, earning the title of the Lion of Allah. He had a huge long sword in each hand and a large white ostrich plume stuck in his turban. And he was very tall, he was very strong, and the enemy quaked just to see him. Quaked just to see him. And he was so quick that he seemed to be at many places at once. But ultimately, the battle ended with a decisive victory for the Muslims. The Meccans lost 70 men, including many of their chiefs, and an equal number had been captured. And those who did return to Mecca did so with heavy hearts full of desire for revenge. Not a house existed without a family member having been slain. And of course, words of hatred directed at Hamzah could be heard everywhere, for he was the warrior whom they blamed for the deaths of many of their fathers, brothers, and sons. And the Muslims, on the other hand, returned home rejoicing, strengthened by their victory and by the evidences of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's favor on them. And they knew that so many deaths would not go unavenged. For the time being, they were in a much better position, a much stronger position than they had ever been beforehand. But after embracing Islam, Hamzah wore no armor into battle. Before he had become a Muslim, he used to wear all the armor, or all of his armor of his time, which was a leather breastplate, an iron helmet, a shield, and so forth. And the armor was designed to ward off the blows of swords and to protect the body from spears and arrows. But Hamzah left his chest open and held an enormous sword with both hands, holding no shield. And people asked him why he was intentionally risking his life. Didn't he know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want us to put our lives at risk unnecessarily? And when he was a young man, he wore armor, so why not now? And his friends and family could not answer or understand. And they told him that arrows and sword have no regard for anyone, and that he could get killed just as easily as anyone else. But Hamzah anhu replied to them, saying that when I was younger, all I thought was about how death deprives a man of worldly luxuries, and I reasoned, why should I unnecessarily hasten my mortal end? But after accepting Islam and as a result of the guidance I've received from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I changed, and now I have no interest whatsoever in this mortal world. I see death as but a key to paradise. Armor should be used only by those who regard death as a dreadful end. What you see as death, I see as eternal life. Alhamdulillah. And he is referenced to being as the chief of martyrs as well, because in the 3rd year after the Hijrah, the Meccans set out for Medina, bent on revenge, and they had prepared long and hard, making and buying arms and armor and pooling the wealth of the city in anticipation of war. And when the Muslims met them at the foot of Mount Uhud, the Meccans had 3,000 soldiers, 700 of them armed, and 200 of them mounted in cavalry. But the Muslim army was much smaller, with 700 muhajirin and only 100 of them fully armed, even a few less mounted. And Rasulullah encouraged his men to hold firm and have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he placed a troop of 50 archers in the mountain pass to prevent any attack from the rear and ordered the remainder of the army to face the enemy. And as the drums of battle had sounded, the Qurayshi women in the rear began wailing and singing the songs. One being, "We are the daughters of the stars of morning. We walk in decorated painted garments with the swinging walk of a goose, the very sight of which bewilders the eyes. Our heads are perfumed with musk. Our garlands are studded with pearls. If you advance on the battlefield, not turning back, we will embrace you. Our painted sheets will be spread for you." So, as was customary, the number of heroes took up the challenge of single combat. And the flag bearer of the Quraysh, Talha ibn Abi Talha, challenged the Muslims, "Is there anyone who can come out to face me?" Ali went to meet him, striking him down with his very first stroke, and Uthman ibn Talha charged forth with a war cry, but Hamzah pounced on him, striking his shoulder with such force that the sword came down to his waist. And Hamzah then cried, "Look, I am the son of Abd al-Muttalib, who supplied water to the pilgrims," thus proclaiming his rightful place in Mecca. And Hamzah, Ali, Abu Dujana, Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, and others fought so bravely that they penetrated the enemy lines and fought deep into enemy territory. Hamzah again defeated the Meccans with the fierceness as which he had also displayed at the Battle of Badr. Yet danger was lurking before them. A man named Wahshi, a slave of Jubair bin Mut'im, whose uncle had been killed at Badr by Hamzah, was an expert spear thrower, and Jubair had commissioned Wahshi to kill Hamzah in exchange for his freedom. So Wahshi had no interest in the battle. He did not care who won. All he wanted was his freedom. So all year he had practiced his spear throwing and waited for the moment of truth, and others encouraged his mission, particularly Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, who had lost her father, uncle, and brother to Hamzah by promising riches if he were successful. And Washi was sitting in a bush behind a rock away from the battle, his eyes glued to the white ostrich plume that clearly marked the position of Hamzah, silently waiting for the right moment to attack. Hamzah, fighting fiercely, was advancing on the battlefield when he slipped and fell on his back, and Washi saw his chance, rose and threw the deadly spear, piercing Hamzah below the waist. And although he tried to rise, he was unable to and died within minutes. And the Quraysh were elated and encouraged by the death of Hamzah, and the battle went on, but the archers soon deserted the rear, allowing the mounted Meccans to come around the side and attack from behind. And fortunately, Rasulullah was defended by determined warriors, and after a great difficulty, the Muslims were able to withdraw to the mountain, and the Quraysh were soon heard celebrating down below. And as a part of the celebration, the women participated in the brutal mutilation of the dead, which was common at that time. They cut off noses and ears of the Muslims, martyrs were there, and hung them around their necks. They danced on their bodies. They sang insulting and horrible songs. Hind, after searching everywhere, found Hamzah's body, and in her fury for revenge, she cut open his body, took out his liver, bit off a piece of it, and spat on it, or spit it out. And as a token of gratitude, she gave all her arm bracelets and jewelry to Washi. She then climbed to a high spot and proudly and loudly proclaimed, "Today we have paid you back for Badr, and a war that follows a war is always violent. I could not bear the loss of Utbah, nor my brother and his uncle and my firstborn. I have slacked my vengeance and fulfilled my vow. You, O Washi, have calmed the burning in my breast. I shall thank Washi as long as I live, until my bones rot in the grave. Who at the time could not have known that both Hind and Washi would enter the fold of Islam 7 years later and will be counted amongst the Sahaba of Rasulullah. But after the Quraysh had then left the battlefield, the Muslims descended from the mountain to recover their dead for burial. And when Rasulullah saw the torn and mangled body of his uncle and friend Hamzah, he was filled with overwhelming grief, and he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy over Hamzah, saying, "May Allah be merciful to you. I know you had a great regard for relatives, and you have always been great and a virtuous leader amongst the people." At the end of the battle, he received the title line of the Rasul, and was thereafter called the chief of martyrs. And still, even through the good news and his conviction and understanding that Hamzah was in the garden, Rasulullah was angrier than ever to see the mutilation of the bodies of the martyrs. He announced, "By Allah, I shall disfigure the bodies of disbelievers, taking revenge for you, Hamzah." And just as soon as he said this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandment was revealed. Surah An-Nahl, the B, Surah 16, ayats 126 to 127. "And if you retaliate, let your retaliation be equal to your wrong. But if you endure patiently, it is indeed better for the patient. Endure patiently. Your endurance is only by the help of Allah. Do not grieve for them, and do not be in distress because of the things that they do." So Rasulullah resolved to be patient and not to retaliate. He made up for his vow of revenge by fasting and feeding the poor, in order that no Muslim warrior should ever do as the Quraysh had done to the dead. And in the meantime, Sophia bint Abd al-Muttalib, Hamzah's sister, was determined to look for Hamzah. Zubair, her son, had tried to keep her from the battlefield as Rasulullah requested him to do so, but Sophia was a powerful and strong-minded woman, certainly a sister of her brother, and she knew about Hamzah and was reconciled that his death was a sacrifice in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hamzah had fully prepared them for what could happen. And she exclaimed, "I will be calm and patient if Allah wills." And Rasulullah finally told Zubair to let her go. And when she found her brother's body cut into pieces, her eyes filled with tears, in her grief, she quietly recited, "We belong to Allah, and to Allah do we return," and asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness for him. And in preparation for burial, Sophia handed over 2 pieces of cloth to be used as a shroud for Hamzah, and Zubair used one of the sheets to cover the body as of an Ansari man nearby, even though the remaining one was not big enough for Hamzah's body. And Rasulullah suggested that they cover his head and face with the sheet, and his legs and feet with grass and straw. And seeing this, the Sahaba grew ever mournful and began to weep, because Rasulullah asked them then why they were crying, and they expressed their sorrow and apologies for not being able to cover his uncle's body fully with cloth because they were very poor. And Rasulullah promised them that a time would soon come when the Muslims would have plenty of food and clothes and enough animals to ride. Then he said, "Allahu Akbar," and conducted the funeral prayer over the body of Hamzah, who was buried first among the martyrs. And his nephew, Abdullah ibn Jahsh, was put in the same grave, and the Rasul recited the funeral prayer over each of the martyrs of Uhud, one after the other, as they were buried beside Hamzah. And when he returned from Uhud, Rasulullah heard the women weeping and wailing for the death of Hamzah. He prayed for them all and thanked them for their sympathy. However, he disapproved of screaming and wailing for the dead. And sometime after Uhud, Rasulullah told Abdullah ibn Abbas that he had seen the following in Jannah: Jafar ibn Abi Talib, his cousin who would die as a martyr in battle 5 years later, flying along with the angels, and Hamzah leaning against a cushion on a throne. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him and all of his family, the prince of chivalry and the line of Allah. And with that, we come to a closing for today's chapter. We'll go ahead and open up for a group discussion, and inshallah, we'll see each other next week. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdi. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.